Welcome to Off the Shelf, Conversations with Local Authors. I'm Martha Kofold, and our guest today is Elinor Swiger. Elinor, would you like to tell us how you got started in writing?
How much time have you got? This is
quite a bit.
This is a bit of a long story.
Right.
I trained as an attorney and worked as an attorney for IRS for some years before my family was born. So I was writing all the time in law school and afterwards. And when my children were born, we moved to New York, and height of the baby boom, no babysitters available, so I was at home with the children and restless to do something other than feeding and mentoring.
I can understand that.
Yeah. I'm sure you can. In any event, when the children got a bit older, we started traveling with them. We went to Mexico and we went to Europe with them. And before we went to Mexico, I had been there, but I decided I would go to the library and get some books for the children so they could have a different viewpoint. I found out there were none. So when I got home, I decided I would write a little book for traveling with children to Mexico, because when you go to other countries, there are many things to see, but not all of them are of interest to children. Right. So, and we also had observed that many, many people were traveling with children, which might not have been true 30 years before. So I wrote a book about Mexico. And the reason, I suppose the only reason that it got published, because you probably know, even 30 years ago, only about 1 in 600 books was accepted for publication by decent publishers. Mm-hmm. So that I had moved to Chicago and gotten involved with a group of writers called the Winona Writers Workshop, Off-Campus Writers Workshop, which met and still meeting 60 years later in Winona every Thursday. And those people concentrate not just on writing, but also publishing, how to sell your writing, how to do it. So I got involved with that group, and luckily, probably not because the writing was great, but because the subject was of interest, I was able to sell the first book that I sent to publishers, which is highly unusual and only the result of the fact that it was different.
Wonderful.
And I suggested to the editor we could do other travel books, and she thought that was a great idea. So we then took the kids to Europe and did another travel book about what you wanted to do in Europe. Now there again, you go to Paris, the kids aren't interested in everything, but you can find things that are of interest to them in each of the major cities.
Tell me, how old were your children at this point?
Let's see, they were probably, when we went to Europe, they were probably 10, 11, 12, something like that. So they knew something about these places, but not much. And I used a system of, I did a lot of research beforehand, and then I took them to each of these places to get their reaction. For example, we went to the Tower of London, and they have, of course, very many armaments of olden times in that tower. And one of the boys said, "This looks like a discount store for fighting equipment." So I used that line in the book, but that sort of thing, anyhow. And then after that, the teachers started asking me to come and speak because a real live author, they thought that would be of interest to the children because I could show my book and so forth, spurring them to do writing. And one of the teachers happened to know that I had been an attorney, or was an attorney, and so the kids started asking me questions about law. And I thought this was very unusual, but I collected maybe 600 or 700 of them and made a book, Everything You Wanted to Know About Law If You Were in Junior High School, for example. And that led to a high school textbook. A local publisher said, "I saw your junior high book, could you just fix it up a little bit for high school?" I said, "I can't fix it up a little bit, I'll give you a different outline." So that was the only one that was solicited. The others I sent to the publishers. And the reason for doing 4 different publishers is editors leave. The editor who did the travel books left the publisher, so then you're working with somebody else and that doesn't work out. So that's why I went to different publishers. But the reason why I finally went back to the practice of law and quit writing in that way was that it's difficult to work with publishers. I never got financially in trouble with them. They always paid the royalties, but they are dilatory. You do all this research, you wanted to get the book on the shelf, right? It'll be a little later, a little later, a little later.
Do the publishers supply the editor always, or do you
sure.
have a choice?
Sure. Oh, you never have a choice. The editor is the person who guides you at the publisher's direction. Yeah.
And authors often, usually give credit to other people who stimulated them to write these books.
Yes, that's true. And the editors that I had, for the most part, were helpful. They were helpful.
Right. And you mentioned this Winona Writers Group. Do people in that group specifically assist you, or do they read your preliminary drafts?
The way it works is the attendees are authors, and yes, we give each other support, but they have speakers. It's a system where they have other writers come in and help you, or even more important, editors come in and speak. We always have a speaker, and then there's a sharing of manuscripts. And this was started, 1940s, as I say, many, many years ago. Every Thursday morning at the community center in Winona, a group of about 70 or 80 women gather and share this. And many of those girls have written 15, 20, 25 books that were published.
Always women in this group?
No, there are some men now in the early days that you can appreciate. I moved here in 1967 and just saw a little notice and began going to that group. At that time, there were no men, but like other parts of society, men have been added, and there's currently a male president of the group, but it's mostly women.
And you're still active in this group?
Not active. I just still belong, and I go to the once-a-year holiday party to meet with my friends, because, of course, in a situation like that, you develop a lot of friendships because everybody's interested in the same thing.
As a result of being in that group, have you been a mentor to any other authors?
In some respects, yes, because you share your insights. You share your insights, and I shared quite a few of those when I was working with different publishers. It's different than taking writing courses. When I moved here, I thought I'd take some courses at Northwestern because I was a high school editor, and you always think, there are many people that want to write. And I thought, but this is, I'm sure that would have been helpful. This is much better because there's an incentive to publish. There's an incentive to publish. Everybody is interested in publishing, and we deal with editors and a lot more of the practical aspects of getting published, less on the writing.
Well, and because your books address law, would you like to tell us how you got interested in law? Were you always interested in being an attorney?
It says so in my high school senior paper, but I didn't remember it so much. But I did have a very unusual experience. I went to Ohio State University, and I had an unusual advisor there. Understand that even in the late 40s, Ohio State was probably 20,000 or so, and I went to a tiny high school of 100 students. So it was an adjustment, but when I got there, I happened to major in political science, which always interested me, and I had an advisor for a class. He happened to give a class, and he gave some sort of I think it was an Army test, some kind of test. We were guinea pigs for his little experiments, and I somehow did well on the test, and the advisor called me into his office and said, "What are you going to do with your life?" I said, "Well, sir, I thought I'd get a PhD in political science and teach." "Dumb idea," he said. "Terrible discrimination against women in the universities. You'll end up in Podunk Junction. You don't want to do that." He said, "What do you think about law school?" I said, "Well, I was sort of thinking about it, but I don't know." Well, he told me then that there was a program at Ohio State where you could take your senior year of undergraduate as your first year of law school, and if you passed, you had that saved a whole year's tuition.
What a great incentive.
Yeah, it was a great incentive. But, of course, it's a gamble because in law school you only have one test at the end of the year. And you don't know how you're doing. And I said, well, I'd like to do that, sir, but I'm not sure. I don't, well, if I can gamble. He said, I hear there's a new test called the LSAT, and I'll arrange for you to get that test and take it so you'll feel more comfortable. It was not required, and it wasn't required for some years, but he took the initiative of getting that test from the publisher and letting me take it so I could feel assured because I did well on it. And that was, my children went to 3 different colleges, and they were always searching for their advisor. It was the role of advisors. I don't know if you've got children.
I know.
You think about this.
It's changed a
and
great
this is
deal.
in a school of 20,000. Here we have a man who's
Yes.
that interested in his students. In any event, I did go to law school, did well, had very, very good professors, one of whom suggested I might want to go to the chief counsel's office in IRS, which I did for 5 years, where I met my husband.
Was this in Ohio or?
Ohio. This is in Washington, D.C.
Oh, you were. Oh,
Because chief counsel's office for IRS was then centralized in Washington, D.C.
I see.
And it was a wonderful experience. There were probably 8 or 9 women. I met about 100 men in that office.
You captured one of them.
Yes.
Wonderful.
And the irony of that is that with the single women, we're always looking at the new hires to see how they would make out. And I saw this fellow came from West Virginia, and I said, oh, we don't want him because he's from West Virginia, because I grew up in Ohio where we looked down on West Virginians. I'm embarrassed to say that, but
Yes.
it was true. Anyhow, he turned out to be a good guy. So we got married, and I worked for a while afterwards, but then he took a job in New York, and then I was offered a job there, but it was not possible. I don't know if you remember the height of the baby boom. You couldn't get a sitter to go to a funeral. Well,
I would have been in that area.
yeah, I thought so. Yeah, it was fun.
What an interesting story. Is there anything you'd like to add to?
Well, I'll tell you, I will say that I spent 28 years working at a local Chicago law firm, which I liked very much. But some years ago, I took part-time off to run for a state representative. I didn't win, but it was a good experience. But
Yes.
anyhow, I retired a couple years ago. And when I retired, I was restless what to do. So I discovered through a friend a wonderful self-publishing, so I wouldn't have to work with publishers. And I did an autobiography, which I think I brought a copy of here.
You did.
And I also did a book of essays that way.
Right.
So.
Let's talk about the autobiography first. You've told us a great deal about your background and how you came to be a writer. Is there anything more in the autobiography that you'd like to share?
Well, I don't know. One of the things that's nice about, I don't know how much you know about this self-publishing.
I know nothing about it.
Anyhow, one of the nice things is I worked with someone and had some guide in terms of the way of setting it up, and I was able to include a lot of pictures. I had always taken pictures, but I didn't realize until I went to assemble them that I had 55 albums. So
I can believe that.
I've always told my husband, if we have a fire, I don't forget the jewelry, I want the albums.
Yes.
He said, we'll never be able to carry 55 albums out of the house in a fire.
I believe that.
Yeah.
And in the other book that you wrote, the essays?
The essays I've done
Related
over
to
a
what?
period of many years, and you don't maybe know how difficult it is to publish essays because they're people's opinions. And if you're a famous person or well-regarded, people are interested in your opinions. If you're just an ordinary soul, nobody's interested. And so I was not able to market them. I had a dream of sometime doing a column called The Other Side, which would be, because of legal training or just orneriness, I've always thought there's an other side to most things. And very often, you've probably noticed in the major media, they take one position and you don't get much information about the other side. So I thought that would be fun, but I could never sell it.
Regarding the self-publishing and your remarks about the most recent book that you have done on essays. Would you care to compare that with the book that you wrote previously about the women lawyers?
Well, let me start with the authors because that occurred a while back. And the reason why I did it was the textbook and the other books, junior high and senior, and by the textbook for law or for the high school was, by the way, picked up by another publisher and published as a book for adults because it's about various subject matters. In other words, it's about if everything you wanted to know about driver's licenses and accidents, and then also what about if you inherited money, what would happen.
Good subjects.
It's different subject matters so that teachers could pick up for a unit at high school. If they wanted a unit on law, they could use this book that way. Anyhow, that book occurred in that fashion. And then it involved a huge amount of research. So I decided I didn't feel motivated to do that again. And I had known some well-known women lawyers, and I thought at that time, understand 30 years ago, there were very few women lawyers, or not, certainly not. In fact, when I graduated from law school in 1951, there were 3 of us in a class of 131. It just wasn't done. I don't think there was discrimination, but it just wasn't done.
What a challenge.
Until the 70s, it wasn't popular. In any event, there are some very interesting women who pursued law in early days, and so I wanted to feature on those. One of those women was Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who had about the same timeline as I did in terms of her education. And she was well known because she had argued some of the first women's rights cases in the Supreme Court. She later became, and I interviewed her and her husband and her children, and she was also a mother. It was interesting to me to indicate how people who had families could devote themselves to this full practice of law, which she did. She also taught at Columbia Law School. In any event, later, when she was appointed to the Supreme Court, I wrote to my publisher and said, we should really reissue this book, which was out of print by that time, and didn't get a word of response. So that tells you something about publishers. But anyhow, that was very interesting. I also, I did a person in each part of the country because that was published by Simon Schuster, so it was going to be national. And one of the interesting anecdotes is I needed somebody from New England. So I went, my husband was there for seminars at Harvard, and he knew that there was a woman who was the first woman tenured professor at Harvard Law School in the tax department. And so I called her to get an interview set up when we were going to be in Boston. And she said to me, "Oh, I can't do that." I said, "Why?" She said, "Well, all that publicity." So I spent the next half hour persuading her no one would ever read this book. There would be no publicity. She didn't have to worry. My writer friends got a big charge out of that because the truth of the matter is, unless you're a best-selling author, the publishers don't waste any money on publicity. You have to do it yourself. So I laughed about the fact that I spent a half hour persuading her that no one would ever read the book, and so I got the interview.
Very good.
It was a lot of fun. Anyhow, in terms you ask about the self-publishing, that's a rather newer phenomenon. You understand my books were published 30 years ago, which is ancient.
Yes.
But a friend of mine in this same writers group that I spoke of, the Off-Campus Writers Workshop is the correct name of it, someone in that group guides people and helps them to do self-publishing. In this case, she came to my house and worked on my computer and managed to take all the materials off the computer and put them in the proper order. Now, there are many of my friends who are much more adept at the computer than I am, so they wouldn't need that help. But she was very helpful, and she put me in touch with somebody who put it all together. It's a complicated process, but it's not on balance very expensive, but it's complicated. It took us a lot of time, and as I told you, I had to sort out pictures and everything for the autobiography.
Oh, very
And
good.
I think it's a very nice job. Soft cover. I suppose you could get
Yes.
them in hardcover, but I really don't know. I know that soft cover are the ones that I'm aware of.
Is this at your own expense then?
Yes, but it's not expensive. I was very shocked to know that it's not very expensive. I can't remember, the book of essays might have been $300 or $400, something like that. And that's nothing compared to what it would be
Right.
otherwise. But the publishers have been so combined that it's very difficult now to get anything published because they really like people that are already famous.
Sure. Well, perhaps you will be
No.
in the future yet.
No, we're talking about the downslope here.
Thank you so much.
This was fun for me. I enjoyed meeting you.
Thank you. And thank you for watching.